With this one, again, this is very high contrast. For the next minute while I talk about this, don't look at me, look at the painting, and try not to blink. Let your eyes just totally relax, and I'll tell you when to look away.
Like a cleansing breath.
Now blink and look at the wall. Do you see anything? Some of you may actually see it on the painting itself. So right here, it's difficult to see, is an after image of this form. To the point that if you look at it long enough, you start thinking it is an after image, which would happen. There were times that I would be working on this and I kept trying to blink out what I was seeing, not realizing I had painted it. So there became this weird relationship between the painting literally having the same visual oddities as what was happening on the object that I was looking at. Something else that I noticed during this process is once you start noticing all of these visual abnormalities, you can't stop noticing these visual abnormalities. And that got me to work with Dr. Tyson Lee at Carnegie Mellon, who is a perceptual neurologist. And I went to him and asked the question, is it possible that if you look at something long enough, that you start noticing so much that you can only ever see things in this hyper-real way? And he said, well, the fact that you're asking that question clearly means that the answer is yes, because this is happening to you.
Oh dear.
So as I would work on these, having that super intense sort of vision, I would get up to go eat lunch or something, and it would take me a couple of minutes to readjust, because I would start looking at my sandwich very, very carefully, with the lights reflecting off the jelly and all that. And the truth is, we can't do that all of the time. Right? I'm always telling my students, imagine if you're driving and you see a stop sign, and your first thought is, oh, isn't it so beautiful the way that the light filters that shadow of the leaves, and the way that that highlight just hits that top edge so perfect. You're gonna run right through the stop sign. For most of our life, we purposely don't look at things very carefully, because if we did, we'd never get anything done. The sort of luxury that an artist has is to spend that time. So to me, when I think of making these pieces, this is sort of a way to highlight all of those things that you might overlook, because I've had that opportunity to look at something for long enough to sort of share that with you. Before I talk about the other parts in the series, do you have any questions on the paintings themselves? I'd be happy to answer. Yeah.
The sketches, you would do that after? You're saying you do the painting and then you go to painting the object and then do the sketch?
Excellent question. All of the above. So the first couple of things that I did were in fact the sort of panel paintings. The second thing that was added was the drawings. The third thing that was added was painting on the objects. All of this, however, happened back and forth. I had 3 areas set up in the studio, and I would rotate between them. What made me go to one day and one the other day? It was probably the way that the light was reflecting off of something. I wouldn't necessarily do one object, paint, draw, work on sculpture. It would go back and forth.
Oh, that's interesting.
So all 3 forms of art, you've got the sculpture, the pencil, and the paint.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's it. I thought you would have done, put the object together, constructed it, then did the pencil sketch, and then added the color in the paint. Then you
That's
could
what
tell
I
us-
thought.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, wrong.
I don't know how you go back to the simplicity
I thought they were all
of the
unfinished.
sketch, not that they're simple, but to get that sketch after you've looked at this and gotten all of these light variations.
It's a very interesting question, because typically we think of an artist doing the drawing turns into the painting, and that's the way that it
Yeah.
works. I saw these a little bit differently. I saw each of these as a mode of depiction that focused on a different aspect of the object. So with the paintings, I was focusing primarily on the color. The fact that the color creates somewhat of an illusion of the form happens because in real life, that combination of colors makes us feel as if the object is 3-dimensional. It's a good transition into the drawings. I think after working with the color version of the paintings, and I started having so many objects that the idea of painting all of them, I almost was too excited. I needed to do something that took a little less time, which took me to the drawings. think I wanted to understand them more acutely. So I kind of think of these as blueprints or structural drawings, trying to really understand what is the form of these things that I put together, in a way that when you're focusing on color, it's not necessarily something you're seeing. Well, just like I started noticing these weird refractions, reflections, and after images, when I started working on the drawings, something very, very strange happened, which was I'd be drawing part of it, and I'd get to a section and I'd draw the shadow. And then some time would pass, and I'd still be drawing a section, I'd get back down to the shadow, which had moved. Back to the object, the shadow moves again. So these end up being drawings that reflect the time spent observing the object. Because unless you're taking a photograph, the world changes. And that's something that, if we're thinking of representation sort of being naturalistic or referring to the way that we physically perceive the world, we perceive it over a period of time, not in these frozen moments. So what you're seeing with a lot of these marks is simply the shadows changing throughout the process of drawing it. So these were all done with natural light right by a window. The most curious thing that I found, I expected that a drawing that took a particularly long time would have a very long set of shadows, and the drawing took a short period of time would have a short set of shadows. It seemed to make sense. They actually reflect weather patterns and the time of day way more than they expect the time spent. So this is one where you can, it's almost madness the way that they all sort of go across. It's because there was a storm coming, and as this big storm is coming, you have the sun on one side in the cloud, and as it covers, the position of the light changes entirely. There were other sections, this is a good one, where it almost seems that the light didn't move at all. My studio is on the 3rd floor, the light is sort of diffuse. So if it's a bright sunny day, you could theoretically have 8 hours of about the same type of light. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about the drawings, since there's obviously a lot of them?
How long does it take you to do a drawing?
This is going to depend largely on the object. I'm going to this one because this one took a long time. I'm trying to think. I would say 2 or 3 days, but so that would end up being, if I'm putting in about 9 hours a day. So that can be a long time looking at something. That's probably on the extreme. The most of them are probably about 12 to 15 hours, I think, on average. I found that they took less time the more that I did, because when you're learning to look at one object carefully, you're learning to look at all objects carefully. And there start to be certain things that you look for, that you notice. I think in the process of doing this, I technically became more competent too, because if you spend that many hours drawing, practice makes perfect, right? So to some extent, I think that also sped it up. One of the things that I most enjoyed was any time there were transparent sections. So this is actually transparent with an object coming through it. And that was really, really neat to see, because anytime you have something which is partially transparent, the light diffuses through it, and all sorts of odd things begin to happen.
So you may have one object, but 3 pieces of art off of one object.
Yes. Yes.
Is there a name for this that you created? Do you have is it a genre right now?
Good question.
I don't think I have a genre, no, but if you would like to give me a genre, I can also give you a cut for that part of it. So I think of the objects themselves as reconfigured objects, hence the name of the show. They're reconfigured because they're from sort of abandoned parts, but it's not necessarily that they're abandoned as much as they've kind of used up their natural function. And here's a way to bring them into a new function. Genre. Yeah, I'm not certain.
We'll work on that.
We'll work on that. I would say that in the last maybe 15 years, you're starting to see more and more artists looking at naturalistic representation as opposed to sort of photorealism. And the difference being, instead of trying to make something look perfect like a photograph, you're showing all of the abnormalities and oddities and quirks of how it is that we see the world. A particularly strange one is that we don't actually see the world in 3 dimensions. It seems impossible because right now I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, and we're all seeing 3 dimensions. What actually happens is we see a perfectly flat image. That's what our retinas bring in. Then, our visual cortex is processing that into something that we see as 3-dimensional. That's based on prior learning. So for instance, I know that the people in the back are not actually significantly smaller than the people in the front, right? I know that it's just they appear that way because they're farther away. That's something that we've all learned. So when we see it, we naturally project that there's a certain distance. So, one thing I find really fascinating about representation in this sort of 2-dimensional world is that it actually mimics that same process. So just like our eyes are bringing in sort of a 2-dimensional flat representation of something and trying to make it seem as if it's 3-dimensional, that's really what's happening in the drawings and paintings as well. I'm bringing in from a 3-dimensional world into a 2-dimensional, physically flat space. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, I know it's very strange to think of. There was a French philosopher, Merleau-Ponty, who said that the world is a mass without gaps. And I remember the first time I heard that, it was like just prancing through the hallways with excitement because it felt like everything clicked. And what he was saying is that the whole world is in fact, looks like it's flat to us. There's no space between anything. Everything that you're seeing, I'm standing here, this is hitting this. This is hitting the thing that's very far away. So even though there's this 3-dimensional space, when we flatten everything, it's just a whole bunch of surfaces. Which leads me to the sculptures. Let's go back here. No, you're fine. So, working in the studio, as far as I'm concerned, this work is going to be about doing the paintings and the drawings. I think I've got it all solved. Until I start wondering, what would happen if I actually painted on the objects themselves? And this is what always happens to artists. As soon as you think you have any sort of conclusion, creativity gets a hold of you and you have some other idea. I was trying to sort of eliminate the middleman. So instead of looking at the object, when I see something, making a mark that looked like it, what if I made the mark that I was seeing on the object itself? So let's say here, for instance, we have a series of blue and this almost cat eye shape. So if I saw that shape, I would paint it, literally, directly back onto the object. So I'd mix the color and put it right where it existed in the world. Odd things started to happen. Because these are all small and sort of handheld, because they're from objects that were previously functional, so they had some relationship with the size of your hand, I'd have to hold them to paint them. So okay, great, I'd be doing this section, and then I would turn it to paint the next section. Well, now I've changed all of the reflections. And every time I would move it, I would change all of the reflections. In fact, you'll notice in a lot of these objects, these sort of red and peaches come up a lot. It's because one of the aprons that I was wearing for painting was red and peach. So I kept reflecting onto it. And that started to be fun, because then I would think, oh, well, today I'm going to wear green, because I think green would look really nice here. So I almost started to curate what I was seeing the same way I did with those original still life, where I was setting up a situation to get the reflections. Now, like the drawings, these ended up relating to time. Because if an object is previously reflective, every time I move it, it has a new surface, right? Until I paint it, at which point I've sort of arrested in time that one observation. And when I move it around, it was no longer shiny. The paint itself was matte. These are just glazed so that they're safe. So that meant that I would look at it, and I had sort of stopped. That one section could no longer have reflections. Does that kind of make sense? So slowly but surely, I was almost forming a skin, sort of covering all of these objects. And I like that, because if I go back to that idea of being in the museum and sort of having this sense of mystery, it's eliminating more cues. Now if you look at it, you're not exactly sure what the physical material is that's underneath the paint. I've kind of taken texture away from you. You can't necessarily know what that is. There are some of the objects that were transparent. You can no longer tell that they're transparent. All the way over there, but if we look at the 3 objects that are hanging, for instance, the one all the way on that right, that top sort of canopy shape, was completely clear plastic. So depending on where you look through it, it was me literally looking through it, seeing the object underneath. Now that one perspective sort of gets frozen in time onto the object itself.
Did you have 2 of those at one point, or is that the after image of the where the painting is finished?
I'm sorry, Charlie.
Did you have, is there a painting that has 2 of those?
Oh! Fantastic. Where is that?
It's, I just saw it
Yeah,
somewhere,
it's
yeah.
Back over here.
Was it rotating?
You know, Barbara, you can just take that one right off the wall if you want, and I'll show them. It's a fantastic question. Do you see in this one that it almost seems like there are 2 objects? That's just the shadow.
Oh, it is.
It's the light going through the perfectly clear form. Now, there are some things that are slightly unclear. I started having fun with hot glue, and I could melt the plastic and get it to distort and harden in different ways, so that it would change the level of transparency or translucency, and it would change how the light refracted. So those are some of the different kind of blobs that you see. And then probably lastly, I should note the large painting here in the back. At one point in time, it was hard to ignore that I was starting a literal collection of all of these strange forms in myself, and I had almost created my own curiosity cabinet. So, I decided I wanted to sort of have a capstone piece in the show that would show them together in their own sort of abnormal space. So here they are presented, laid out on the glass shelves for you to see. I was trying to create a space that I thought was, you can never make something totally neutral, but that you're not quite certain where this exists. Is this in some sort of museum? Is this in a store? Is this inside sort of a closet? I wanted that to sort of stay open, which is why it's so cropped in. Because again, I wanted to maintain some sense of mystery. So now we know that they all sort of come together in some way, but have not necessarily any idea, other than aesthetics, what the function is of having them put together in one collection.
Is that why your choice of scale is so small, rather than like using garbage cans and tires and things like that? I mean, you know, they're all very precious. They're almost like little jewels, you know, rather than, you know, like what Rauschenberg does.
Right,
with this.
absolutely.
So I'm just trying to, you know, if you can tell us about your choice of that, because the drawings are, you know, everything seems to be very precious.
Okay, that's a very good question. There was a point where I kept trying to do things that were bigger. So I'd bring bigger forms up to the studio. I would sort of start seeing what they look like together, and then promptly put them away and take back out the little things. I think it has to do with them relating to that size of your hand. While we don't know what they are, a lot of these objects, we're going to know what parts of them are, or they may feel very familiar to you in a certain way, and they feel familiar because you're used to sort of holding them. I was talking to someone at the museum today who told me that they have difficulty trying to get people not to pick up the objects. And that was sort of the sense that I wanted, where you wanted to come in physically close to it and have that sort of tactile memory with the form. Also, close observation happens close up. So by making them sort of precious, it forces you to have that moment where you come in very tightly and you look at something. In a sort of gallery context like this, I think that's heightened. Because once you have light coming down on something and you sort of have this tiny jewel with a pristine white space, I think that happens a lot more. But it's a good question.
I'm going to make a suggestion, going one step further, because my husband recently has become very interested in jigsaw puzzles. This would be fabulous. Made into tiny little pieces, all shaped the same.
Well,
Sell.
this this is the funniest part, that's not the first time about a totally different piece of artwork that I've been told to make a jigsaw puzzle. So there's something about that.
It's
I had-
fascinating.
I had done a piece of 197 birds with blue markings on them.
Oh,
And I just sort of went through ornithological guides across the world trying to find every sort of perching bird that had some color blue on it. And I now look back at that and see the relationship between that and what I'm doing now. That I'm looking at these tiny little changes. How do we categorize what we see? How do we put things together? And that one also, I was told, to make an excellent jigsaw puzzle. So one of these days, I may wait till I have enough pieces, and then I will start my own jigsaw puzzle. But I see what you're saying.
We'll
It
be
makes
there
you
to
look
buy.
carefully about the pieces without knowing what they are. It's
Oh, I
interesting.
know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, all of your work, I mean, I can see like a plug in there,
Yeah.
or like an air freshener or something. So they're all pieces that were utilitarian at one time, and now they're broken apart into different components. Have you ever had the experience of, when you are putting these parts together, of actually creating a utilitarian piece? By accident? Or because they've come apart by accident?
Oh, all the time.
Right.
Yeah, before I figured out how to get them together, that was true.
Right.
Lamps. I see lamps, I see toys.
I would say this. None of them can be, for instance, none of them can do a task on their own, right? So some of these things before you could plug in,
Right.
and they would sort of take care of themselves. There are some that sort of refer back to their original purpose. So the middle window right there by the gentleman, that top part is clamped together because the clamp is performing its original function by holding together these forms. Now, it's no longer, I think it's supposed to like shove an oyster or something. It's no longer doing that, but the clamping mechanism is still in action. The piece that I had, well, if you look at that orange painting of it, there's that top piece I had showed you early on. That's held together because it's a magnet. So the magnet maintains that sort of relationship. Whether or not I could take any of these as a tool to do something else, probably could.
I mean, it may happen.
Yeah, I mean, it probably could. I don't see why, for instance, one couldn't hammer the back of this and create a hole in the wall to put a nail in or something. I mean, it could theoretically happen. But that would be having a new function as opposed to performing its old function.
Right.
So this is
That-
no longer going to, you can't press those buttons and turn a radio on.
That's what I mean,
Yeah.
new function.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I have not come across that noticeably, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't use it for that. And there are a lot of artists that very much investigate taking these tools, putting them together for a new, almost comical purpose in some cases.
They are beautiful. what
Oh,
you
thank
do.
you.
They're very beautiful.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for coming out and for listening.
Thank you.